the feck for Charlie, forward and draw the sword, forward and up and rally, and the royal prince's word.
See the northern clans advance and see Glengarry and Lochiel, see the brandish broadsword glance and Highland hearts as true as steel.
This is the story of the greatest manhunt Britain has ever seen, and it started here at Culloden Moor, just a few miles south of Inverness. On the 16th of April 1746, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the rightful heir to the British throne, faced his first ever but crushing defeat here at Culloden. It was at the end of 9 months' campaign to try and win back his father's crown. His army annihilated, the prince had to escape and he took to the hills. He wasn't to know that was the beginning of 5 months on the run. He was harried through the mountains, across the islands, by the full might of the British Army and the British Navy. He lived in constant fear of death or capture and betrayal, and he had a £30,000 reward on his head. Now that is the equivalent of nearly £30 million today. As escape and evasion goes, this is off the scale. And this is the story of how he did it. Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he became known, was the grandson of King James II, who had lost his throne in 1688 for being Catholic and fled with his family to France. From their exile, the Stuarts and their supporters, known as Jacobites, had tried several times to win the crown back. But by the 1740s, their Protestant cousins, the Hanoverian King Georges, seemed very well established. However, in 1745, the Stuarts, promised help by King Louis XV of France, saw another opportunity. In July 1745, the 24-year-old Prince Charles Edward Stuart landed in the far west of Scotland at Arisaig on Loch Namouv, a few miles south of the tiny port of Mallaig. He came with only 7 men and little money or weapons. But what the prince lacked in resources, he made up for with immense charisma, courage and strategic vision. Brought up in the gilded palaces of Rome, the prince had been denied, through years of Hanoverian diplomatic pressure, the usual military experience gained by most European princes. But instead, Charles had prepared all his life for what he regarded as his destiny. He had become a fitness freak and a crack shot, running and hunting in the hills around Rome. With his drive and mesmeric charm, the prince soon won over the reluctant Highland chiefs and their clan armies. Equipped now with the terrifying shock tactics of the Highland Charge, the prince and his supporters took Scotland, beating every force sent against them, and marched south. But at Derby, in December, only 130 miles from London, his Highland commanders, spooked by being so far from home, insisted on turning back, to the prince's immense frustration. Little did they know that the capital was in panic. George II had boats packed with his belongings in the Thames. London was Charles Edward Stuart's for the asking. They were now being stalked by a stronger enemy than they had ever faced before, larger, better armed, more experienced, and crucially under the leadership of a man who had everything to lose if the Stuarts won the throne, George II's son, the Duke of Cumberland. For 4 months, the prince's army continued to retreat north into the hills, much to his despair. But it was here, at Culloden, that April, that the army met their first and final defeat. His army routed, military reputation in tatters, the prince was hustled from the battlefield. The prince's relationship with his commanders, rocky since Derby, was now in danger of completely breaking down. One issue was that most of the Scottish chiefs just wanted to return to an independent Scotland and their former power and influence. But the Stuarts were always aiming for the United Kingdom. Also, the prince's lack of military experience, compared to his seasoned commanders, or indeed the enemy general, the Duke of Cumberland, was coming to a head. Culloden had been the prince's first defeat, and he didn't know how to deal with it. The prince and his party galloped west, and on the road they met Lord Lovat, chief of the powerful Clan Fraser.
Lord Lovat and the prince only met once. They met at a factor's house on the south side of Loch Ness called Gortlek, Thomas Fraser of Gortlek's house. And that's where Lovat was waiting for news of Culloden, which he fully expected to be a victory since they'd never lost a battle so far. And that was the place that Bonnie Prince Charlie went to as he began his flight from the battlefield. He was already thinking of going back to France for reinforcements, and Lovat at that point very definitely, fearing for the safety of his people, wanted him to stay and fight in the hills. He may also have believed that it was the right thing to do to win Scotland back, but he definitely thought it was the right thing to do to protect the Highlands from the wrath of Cumberland's army. And he famously reminded Bonnie Prince Charlie that that he should remember his ancestor, Robert the Bruce, who lost 11 battles and won Scotland with the 12th. And the prince just thanked him and moved on.
After his meeting with Lovat, the prince wrote to the Highland chiefs asking them to regroup at Fort Augustus the next day. Then, hotly pursued by Cumberland's redcoats, the prince galloped west from Gortleck, heading to Invergary with a small band of companions. But unfortunately, there had been little planning for defeat, and communications, always poor in the 18th century, had failed in the chaos. Most of the remnants of the prince's army had already headed southeast for Riven, 40 miles away, and they were now separated from the prince by a mountain range. So this is Invergary Castle, or the ruins of it. This is where Bonnie Prince Charlie and his crew of friends finally arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning of the day of Culloden. It was where they spent their first night. When they got here, it was empty. There was no food, there was no furnishings, there was nothing. The crew of people didn't know what to do, but luckily the servant Ned Burke, whose normal job was being a sedan chair carrier in Edinburgh, found a couple of salmon in a net in the river. So he cooked those for them, and the prince and his friends were fed. They spent the night here. The next day they went on. Shortly afterwards, Butcher Cumberland arrived, and he burnt the castle to the ground, and it has remained a ruin ever since. The prince heard that only a handful of his army's survivors had turned up at Fort Augustus. And worse, despite Lord Lovat's advice, many of the chiefs sent word that their clansmen would no longer follow the prince into battle as things were. The only hope, they said, was for him to sail to France, raise men and money and weapons, and return to continue the rebellion. Should he stay or should he go? He decided to head west, and sent a message back to the clans that each man should look after himself. So behind me is Loch Arcade. This is the furthest most point that Bonnie Prince Charlie and his companions were able to go on horseback. They were heading through those mountains down to the sea at Arisaig, where the prince had heard that a ship was waiting to take him to France. But they had to go by foot, and you can see from these hills impossible to go on a horse. They left the horses here, and they went up into the hills. They called it the Darkest Mile. This was the last time the prince would mount a horse for 5 months. He was keeping his options open by heading to Arisaig on Loch Namouv, where the French had dropped him off the previous year, and where he had reason to hope a French ship might be waiting.
Communications being what they weren't in the 18th century, the ships agreed, they were being harried by the British Navy, but in between being harried by the British Navy, they would come into Loch Namouv as often as they could and stay as long as they could and pick up who was ever there to be picked up. And that was the rescue plan.
Right, so this is Loch Namouv, where Bonnie Prince Charlie first landed in 1745 with such high hopes. He come down here several times during his attempt to leave, but unfortunately the French sloops were never in the bay and could never find a ship. The prince waited for a week in Borrowdale House at Arisaig. Confusingly, the debate on whether he should stay or head for France continued, intensifying as refugees from Culloden trickled in with news of vicious reprisals. But the prince had also been told by King Louis XV that some golden French troops were already on their way. Going to France would surely seal that support. King Louis was at war with Britain on the continent. He needed the Jacobite uprising to continue, to force George II to make war on 2 fronts. And then the news came that the redcoats had cut off the Arisaig Peninsula. The prince was trapped, separated from the clans. He decided to go to Uist in the Outer Hebrides to charter his own ship for France. This is pretty much the route that the prince took when he left Borrowdale, which is just over there, to South Uist, which is over there. Luckily for us, the weather was rather better than when he did it. That night there was the most violent storm that anyone could ever remember. And there were English men of war patrolling these waters looking for him. But Charles knew that the redcoats had already worked out roughly where he was. He had to leave Corriedale. He had to escape. Despite the danger, the storm and the men of war. There was a £30,000 reward on his head, and the hopes of the Stuart throne rested on him alone. But when the prince reached Uist, he was trapped again. There were no ships to be had. He was also now the target of one of the most intense manhunts Britain had ever seen. This powdered, silk-clad princeling found himself dropping through a portal into another world. Royal Navy ships were raking the waters between the Outer Hebrides and Skye. Hunted through the islands by redcoats and Highland militia, the prince skulked from cave to rocky hideout, relying on local clansmen to keep him safe while the cordon tightened. On Uist, he was under the protection of the powerful captain of Clan Ranald, one of the great MacDonald chiefs, and his stepbrother, Alexander MacDonald of Boisdale. Right, this is Bonnie Prince Charlie's cave at Corriedale. The prince spent several weeks here. He came back here several times. This is where he sat. This was known as the prince's seat, and he said it was a throne compared to a lot of other places that he'd had to spend time. It's not a very big cave. It's about 8 to 10 foot square. The ceiling height is probably about 4 foot, and the prince was 6 foot tall. But he was safe here.
But this is one of the most isolated places in the whole island. You've got Ben Moor on your left-hand side, and coming over Corriedale and Ben Heckler is a good 10-hour trudge. And if you're standing on the top of Ben Corriedale and Heckler, you can see all the way down. So any people coming in, you'll be able to see from a long way away. And obviously, the prince could have been moved. And from sea, as you can see anyone coming for miles. It's a very strategic point.
And who was looking after him when he was here?
Well, the clan, the MacDonald clan. Specifically, the MacDonalds of Boisdale were the people who were really taking responsibility for him.
Finally, after 2 months in hiding, there came a chance of escape, and one destined to become a legend of romance. By now, the Highlands and Islands were under brutal military law, with those suspected of helping the prince being tortured, killed or imprisoned. It was now even illegal to leave the island without government permission. But a certain Flora MacDonald, the stepdaughter of the commander of the very militia combing Uist for the prince, agreed to secure the vital passes. On the pretence of visiting her sick relative, Lady MacDonald of Slate, on the Isle of Skye. Flora was reluctant initially, ironically more worried for her reputation than the risk of capture. One of the prince's companions even offered to marry her, an offer Flora politely declined. Along with yet another one of her relations, Lady Clanranald, the wife of the great MacDonald chief, Flora met the prince to ready their escape. They were to set off from Loch Wiscavar on the tiny island of Benbecula, now linked by a causeway between North and South Uist. So the night before Charles was due to leave for Skye, Flora MacDonald and her kinswoman, Lady Clanranald, came and joined Prince Charlie and his companions in a bothy over there on the north side of the loch. They were just sitting down to dinner, and apparently the atmosphere was very relaxed when they heard the news that General Campbell and his 200 redcoat troops had just arrived, and they'd landed just here on the island. The total consternation. If you can imagine 200 men scouring this island, and so they immediately stopped eating. They leapt into a boat and they sailed down to the south shore of the loch. And there they then arrived about 5 o'clock in the morning, and they then started, they ate the meal that they hadn't been able to finish before. And then they had to wait. They had to wait, the long, nerve-wracking wait until darkness again, until it was safe for Charles to set sail for Skye with Flora. And wait in the hope that General Campbell and his men were not going to get here, because at this point they were sweeping the island, literally, in rows. Now, the other thing, of course, is that the way Charles was going to undertake this journey was just as a woman. He was disguised as Flora's maid, an Irish woman called Betty Burke. As the prince was so tall, Flora and Lady Clanranald had to make his clothes themselves, and apparently there was a lot of joshing and joking as the prince struggled into his petticoats. That night they set off in a small boat into a terrible storm. They rowed much of the way, hardly able to use a sail in case it was spotted by the patrolling warships. The 30-mile journey took the whole night. And worse, once they arrived, it was immediately obvious that Skye was even more dangerous than Uist. After exhausting journeys back and forth across the island, the prince finally reached the mainland 10 days later. But yet again there was no French ship waiting for him at Loch Namur. As his enemies closed in, the prince headed back up into the hills.
And to talk about bonny Prince Charlie, who of course hid in these parts of the world for many weeks after Culloden, hidden by loyal Jacobites, of whom my ancestor, the gentle Ordeal, was paramount. And we have one or two caves where he's meant to have stayed, although nobody can be quite sure if he did or he didn't. But this is very much country where he would have been safe, I think, despite the reward placed on his head.
Now, in the terms of what he achieved during those 5 months, this escape and evasion, it's off the scale. You've got to really think of something like the hunt for Osama bin Laden. You know, he had this massive price on his head, worth about £30 million today, and nobody betrayed him. He was being hunted throughout the hills, over the seas, by government troops, by ships. Everybody was looking for him, and nobody gave him away. They did it through tiny information cells and the clan system and loyalty. So one clan would look after him in one place, they would deliver him to another place, that clan would take on responsibility, and then he'd be delivered to another.
Ironically, at this point, one of the problems the French identified was the prince was being so well hidden from his enemies that even his friends couldn't find him to rescue him. By now, the powdered chevalier of the portraits was long gone. The prince had transformed into a long-haired, plaid-wearing, red-bearded, midge-bitten, barefoot Highlander. Tragically, during his travels, he also witnessed the destruction meted out on his followers. Houses and crops burnt, murder and rape, dispossession and brutal punishment. He was fully aware now of the danger he represented as he was passed from clan to clan. He apparently had terrible nightmares, groaning in his sleep, "Oh, poor, poor, poor Scotland," and always the threat of exposure and capture lurked at every moment.
So the atmosphere of kind of paranoia was very strong, and they knew that if they were caught, they would be executed. It was extremely dangerous. But he was terribly good at keeping his men's spirits up. If somebody was kind of totally collapsing, he would start singing and dancing, and he whistled a Strathspey reel and danced it in order to raise people's spirits.
He's a rantin' a roving lad, he is a brisk and a bonny lad. Whatever betide I will be glad to follow the laddie with the white cockade.
So this is the A9. It's one of the main arterial roads of Scotland. Back in 1746, it would have been crawling with government troops. But up there, in the hills, there are no roads. Nothing crosses this. You can only do it on foot. And if you're not used to the terrain, it's completely free. I know, I've done it. I was stalking there a few years ago, and I can tell you, you can walk for tens and tens of miles without seeing another human being. Just stags, the heather and the sky. So it was up here in these hills that Charles was being kept safe. This is Macpherson country. He's been looked after by the head of the clan Macpherson, and with him were Cameron of Lochiel and his brother, Dr. Archibald Cameron. Macpherson built a shelter for them called Clooney's Cage. It was made out of wood and trees all woven together. It had 2 stories. One room was for where they kept the drink and the food, and the drink was becoming increasingly important for this group of people, and the other is where they lived. They were actually making it ready to live in for the winter when Charles heard in mid-September the extraordinary and very welcome news that 2 French ships had been sighted on the other side of Scotland in the bay in Arisaig. John Macpherson arrived at Clooney's Cage at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of September and broke the news that there were French ships waiting here. Now, the ships had been here since the 6th of September. They'd been here a week. He broke the news, and you can imagine the kind of excitement and jubilation. And Bonnie Prince Charlie insisted that they set off immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. So off they went. Bonnie Prince Charlie wasn't very well. He was suffering from dysentery. The midges are, as you can see, completely terrible. And they walked. They walked over these vast mountains for days. And they finally got down here on the 20th of September, arriving here. And what must he have felt like when he walked over those hills over there and saw laid out in this beautiful, beautiful sea loch the 2 French ships which were his tickets to freedom. So this loch here, Loch Namur at Arisaig, is where the story began and where it ended. A year and a bit of heroism, of victory and then defeat, and then 5 months on the run in the heather. When Bonnie Prince Charlie left,
He was sure he was coming back. He didn't think he was deserting these people. He thought he was going to France, get some money, get some weapons, come back here and keep carrying on the fight. But he never returned.
For what the prince did not realise was that during the 5 months he had spent on the run, the geopolitical situation in Europe had changed. The French were now winning their war against Britain on the continent, and King Louis no longer had any need of the Stuarts.
For the rest of his life he spent on the continent, mired in plots. He'd become an alcoholic on this journey. His life didn't end well, and he never returned to Scotland, but the legend has never gone away. Now, whatever the tragedy of Bonnie Prince Charlie's later life, and it was tragic, nowadays probably he'd be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He had all the classic symptoms: alcoholism, failure to maintain close relationships, domestic abuse, everything, paranoia. But whatever you can say about that part of his life, this here is where the legend of the Bonnie Prince was born. At the time, a man who wrote who'd been one of his companions said, "Those 5 months, never has a prince been a skulking in the heather for those 5 months, living in hunger, in fear, and maintaining his morale, maintaining his good spirits, and finally managing to escape."
Better blood ye cannot